Welcome everyone to Revenge Blaze, your home for the most gripping stories of justice, family drama, and ultimate redemption. We specialize in bringing you tales where the truth finally comes to light, and those who betray their own blood face the consequences they deserve. Please stay with us until the very end, because today's story is incredibly intense, and we have another fascinating tale lined up right after this one that you won't want to miss. Without further ado, let us begin. Today's story is titled, Kicked Out by My Daughter and Her Husband. I cooked a final feast that made them beg on their knees. I was sitting at the head of the table, my thin fingers tracing the delicate patterns of the lace tablecloth, trying to stop them from shaking. My name is Rosalind. I am 67 years old, and I have spent my entire life believing that family was a sanctuary. But 48 hours ago, that sanctuary turned into a battlefield. I sat there in the heavy silence of my dining room in Olympia, staring at the steam rising from the coffee pot, while my daughter and her husband walked into the room with an air of cruel triumph. They didn't even notice the dark purplish bruise hidden under my collar or the way I flinched when the chair scraped against the floor. My daughter grabbed a piece of toast, her eyes cold and mocking as she leaned in close. She looked at me with a smirk that made my blood run cold and said, "Look at you still here. I thought we made it clear that this house doesn't belong to a useless old woman anymore. Why haven't you packed your bags and crawled away yet?" Her husband chuckled, leaning against the doorframe, checking his watch as if he were waiting for a garbage truck to arrive. He sneered. "Finally learned your place, haven't you? Now be a good girl and hand over the keys before we have to get rough again." They thought my silence was submission. They thought the lavish feast I had spent all night preparing was a white flag of surrender. They were so blinded by their own greed and the liquor still on their breath that they didn't notice the third place setting was occupied. The words died in my daughter's throat when the heavy wooden chair next to her shifted. Her face, once filled with arrogance, turned a sickly shade of gray as she realized that my silence wasn't born of fear. It was a death sentence. Before I reveal the shocking identity of the guest who made their world crumble and how I turned their betrayal into their ultimate downfall, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of this journey from victim to victor, because justice is a dish best served cold, and the main course is just beginning. Things didn't simply turn sour overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the life my late husband Arthur and I had built with our own sweat.
This house in Olympia was more than just a structure of Douglas fir and cedar. It was our victory lap after 30 years of grueling shifts at the textile mill. Arthur used to joke that the moss growing on the north side of the roof had more character than most of the people he worked with, and for a long time, the rain pattering against the windows felt like a lullaby rather than a warning. We had a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, a sanctuary where the only drama was whether the deer would get to the hostas before the slugs did. When Arthur passed away 5 years ago, the silence in these hallways became heavy, but it was a peaceful, respectful kind of quiet. That was until a year ago, when the front door creaked open to admit a storm that no umbrella could protect me from. It was a Tuesday afternoon, typical for Washington, gray, drizzly, and smelling of damp earth, when my daughter Giselle appeared on my doorstep with 3 oversized designer suitcases and a husband I barely knew. I remember looking at the gold-plated watch Arthur had given me for our silver anniversary, thinking that 3 o'clock was an odd time for a social call. Giselle didn't wait for an invitation. She brushed past me, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor I had just polished. Behind her stood Spencer Vance, a man who looked like he'd been squeezed into a suit 2 sizes too small for his ego. I'll never forget how he introduced himself with his full name, as if he were running for office instead of moving into my guest room. "Spencer Vance, ma'am. Pleasure to finally see the estate." He had set his eyes already darting around the living room, appraising the value of my antique mantel clock. "Mom, we're in a bit of a pinch." Giselle had announced, flopping onto my favorite velvet armchair without even taking off her wet coat. She explained that their high-stakes real estate venture in Seattle had hit a minor snag, which in reality meant they were one step ahead of a debt collector and a very angry landlord. Spencer chimed in, tossing his keys onto the side table and knocking over a small porcelain bird Arthur had bought me in Switzerland. He didn't even apologize. He just laughed it off, saying that modern decor was more his style anyway. My heart sank, but I was a mother, and in my generation you don't turn your back on family when they're down. I told them they could stay in the guest wing for a few weeks, until they got back on their feet. I didn't realize then that I was inviting two foxes into the henhouse. The first few weeks were a masterclass in passive-aggressive behavior.
Giselle, who I remembered as a bright, albeit slightly spoiled girl, had transformed into a woman who viewed my kitchen as a five-star hotel with a 24-hour maid service. She would leave her dirty coffee mugs everywhere, stained with that expensive lipstick she claimed she couldn't live without despite being bankrupt. One morning, I found her staring at my pantry with a look of pure disgust. "Mom, really? Generic brand oats, Spencer's digestive system is very sensitive. We really need to upgrade the grocery list," she said, tossing a perfectly good bag of grain into the trash. "You have to find humor where you can, when your own child starts acting like a disgruntled hotel guest." Spencer was even worse. He spent his days in his bathrobe pacing the porch and shouting into his cell phone about market fluctuations and leveraging assets. He had this annoying habit of calling me Rosie, a nickname only Arthur was ever allowed to use. Every time he said it, it felt like a cheese grater against my nerves. He'd sit at the head of the dining table, Arthur's chair, and regale me with stories of his imaginary successes. "You know, Rosie, this house has great bones, but it's tragically underutilized. With a bit of a facelift and the right listing agent, meaning me, we could flip this place for a fortune," he'd say, leaning back and picking his teeth with a toothpick. I'd just smile tightly and remind him that the only thing getting flipped in this house was the pancakes on Sunday morning. The toxic signs began to escalate from mere annoyance to something far more sinister as the months dragged on. They stopped asking for things and started demanding them. It began with the utility contribution that never materialized. Spencer would leave every light in the house on and crank the heat up to 80 degrees, claiming his real estate brain needed warmth to function. When the electricity bill arrived, looking like the national debt of a small country, I handed it to him. He didn't even look at it. He just handed it back and said, "Put it on our tab, Rosie. Once the big deal closes, I'll buy you a whole new power plant." He thought he was being charming, but I could see the glint of desperation and greed in his eyes. Giselle started reorganizing my belongings without my permission. I came home from a church bake sale one afternoon to find my mother's hand-knitted blankets stuffed into garbage bags in the garage. "They're a fire hazard, Mom, and they smell like mothballs. We need to modernize the aesthetic if we're going to have clients over," she told me while scrolling through a furniture catalog. When I tried to protest, she rolled her eyes and gave that high-pitched theatrical sigh she'd perfected since she was 16. "Don't be so dramatic. It's for your own good. You're getting older and you're starting to clutter the place up. We're just trying to help you stay organized." That was their favorite phrase, "for your own good." The ultimate camouflage for their own selfishness. The atmosphere in the house turned from damp to freezing. Dinner conversations, which used to be about the neighborhood or Giselle's childhood, became interrogations about my finances. Spencer became obsessed with the deed to the house. He'd bring it up over dessert, swirling his wine, which I had paid for, and acting like he was doing me a favor by reviewing my estate planning. "You know, in this economy, having all that equity locked up in one property is risky for a woman your age. If you transferred the title to a younger, more active manager, we could protect you from taxes." He'd suggest, his voice dripping with fake concern. I knew exactly what he meant by active manager. He wanted a way to pay off his gambling debts with the roof over my head. I started noticing things missing. First, it was just small change from the jar in the kitchen, then a silver serving spoon, and eventually, a piece of jewelry that my husband had given me. When I confronted Giselle about the missing brooch, she didn't even blink. "You're probably just misplacing things, Mom. Early signs of forgetfulness, you know. It happens at 67. Maybe you should let me hold on to the valuables for safekeeping." She said it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that told me she wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I realized then that my home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and I was the one being locked in. The rain drumming against the metal roof of the porch at 3 in the morning brought a biting chill that seemed to seep right through the walls of my home. I was sitting in my worn-out recliner in the living room, the only light coming from a small reading lamp that flickered every time the wind surged through the pine trees outside. I hadn't been able to sleep for weeks, but that night the air felt especially heavy, charged with a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I heard the distant roar of Spencer's engine long before the headlights cut through the fog of the driveway. When the front door finally flew open, it slammed against the hallway wall with a violence that shook the framed photos of Arthur and me. Giselle stumbled in first, her laughter sharp and jagged, like broken glass smelling of expensive gin, and a desperation that no amount of perfume could mask. Spencer followed closely behind his face, flushed a deep, angry red, his tie undone, and hanging around his neck like a noose. They didn't even acknowledge my presence at first, treating me like just another piece of unwanted furniture in the shadows. "Where is it? Rosie?" Spencer bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer. He didn't even bother to take off his sodden coat, leaving a trail of muddy water across the Persian rug that Arthur had gifted me for my 60th birthday. I stood up slowly, my joints aching from the dampness, and tried to maintain a shred of dignity. I asked him what he was looking for, though deep down I already knew the answer. He marched into the kitchen, throwing cupboard doors open with such force that the hinges groaned in protest. Giselle leaned against the counter, lighting a cigarette despite the dozen signs I'd put up forbidding smoking in the house. She looked at me with a cold, glassy stare that made my stomach turn. "Don't play dumb, Mom. We know the deed to the lake property is in that safe upstairs. We need it. Now. Spencer has a bridge loan that needs collateral by morning, or we're going under," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that felt like a knife to my ribs. I found my voice, though it trembled more than I wanted it to. I told them that the lake property was Arthur's legacy, a piece of land intended to be a family heirloom, not a lifeline for Spencer's reckless gambling in the real estate market. I told them I wouldn't let them squander the only thing I had left of my husband's hard work. That was the spark that turned the smoldering resentment into an inferno. Spencer turned around, his eyes bulging with a manic intensity I had never seen before. He took a predatory step toward me, looming over me with his shadow stretching across the linoleum floor. "Listen to me, you stubborn old bat," he hissed, the smell of stale alcohol wafting off him in waves. "That legacy is just dirt and trees. I'm the one trying to build a future here while you're busy worshiping a dead man's ghost. You're going to give us that deed, or I'm going to make sure your retirement is a lot less comfortable than you imagined." Giselle didn't try to stop him. In fact, she took a step forward, joining his side like a well-trained soldier in a war against her own mother. "You're being selfish, Mom. You're sitting on a gold mine while we're struggling to survive. Why do you need all this space? Why do you need that land? You're just an old woman waiting for the end. Give it to us, and maybe we'll let you stay in the basement once we flip this place." She sneered. I looked at my daughter, searching for any trace of the little girl who used to bake cookies with me, but all I saw was a stranger consumed by greed. I stood my ground, clutching the back of a kitchen chair for support, and told them that as long as I was breathing, I would never sign over Arthur's life's work to a man who couldn't even keep a steady job. The physical blow came so fast I didn't even see her hand move. The sound of it, a sharp, wet crack, seemed to linger in the air longer than the pain itself. My head whipped to the side and I felt the metallic taste of blood as my lips split against my teeth. I stumbled back, my glasses flying off my face and skittering across the floor. The world became a blur of colors and shadows, but the sting on my cheek was a searing, white-hot reality. I looked up at Giselle, my vision hazy, and I didn't see a hint of regret on her face. She was panting, her eyes wide with a sick kind of empowerment. "Don't you ever talk about Spencer like that again." She spat, her voice trembling with rage. "He's a visionary. You're just a relic of a past that doesn't matter anymore. If you won't help us, then you're useless to us." Spencer didn't flinch. He didn't offer a hand to help me up. Instead, he stepped over my glasses, crushing the delicate frames under his heel with a sickening crunch. He reached down and grabbed me by the upper arms, his fingers digging into my skin like iron claws. I felt the bruises forming instantly as he hauled me to my feet with a grunt of exertion. "I think it's time for you to go for a walk, Rosie," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He began dragging me toward the front door, my slippers scuffing uselessly against the hardwood. I tried to protest, but the air wouldn't come into my lungs. Giselle followed us, grabbing my thin cardigan from the coat rack and throwing it at me with a mocking laugh. "Enjoy the fresh air, Mom. Maybe the rain will help clear your head and make you realize who's actually in charge of this family." He shoved me through the front door and I landed hard on the wet boards of the porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, the Washington rain soaking through my nightgown in seconds. I turned around trying to reach for the door handle, but Spencer was already pulling it shut. He looked at me through the glass pane, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated coldness. "Don't bother knocking. The locks are being changed first thing in the morning. Since you love this house and its history so much, you can stay out there and admire the view. We're done dealing with your stubbornness," he said. I heard the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place, a sound that felt more final than a funeral bell. I stood there shivering, my breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to mist in the freezing air. The lights in the foyer went out one by one, leaving me in total darkness. I could hear them laughing inside, the muffled sound of a bottle being opened, a celebration of their victory over a 67-year-old woman. My cheek throbbed with a rhythmic pulse and my back ached from where I'd hit the porch floor. But the deepest pain was the realization that my own flesh and blood had discarded me like a piece of trash. I looked out into the rain-soaked garden, the trees Arthur had planted swaying like mourning figures in the wind. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed at 3 o'clock that morning. As the freezing rain washed the blood from my lip, a different kind of warmth began to spread through my chest, a cold, crystalline resolve that would carry me through the next 48 hours. I stood up from the freezing garage floor, wiping a smear of dried blood from my lip with the hem of my soaked nightgown. The concrete felt like a block of ice against my bare feet, and the smell of oil and old cardboard was a stark contrast to the lavender-scented linens I had been stripped of just minutes before. I found an old moving blanket in the corner, a dusty relic from when Arthur and I first moved our lives into this house, and wrapped it around my shoulders. It smelled of him, not the expensive cologne Spencer wore to mask his failures, but a scent of cedarwood hard work, and a safety that no longer existed within those four walls. I slumped against the side of Arthur's old workbench, my body trembling so violently that I feared my bones might actually rattle apart. Looking at the silhouette of his rusted garden tools hanging neatly on the wall, I felt a wave of shame so intense it almost drowned out the physical pain. I had spent 40 years being a protector, a nurturer, and a pillar of strength. Yet here I was, exiled to the shadows by the very life I had given birth to. The silence of the garage was punctuated by the rhythmic dripping of water from a leak in the roof, a sound that reminded me of the steady, quiet patience Arthur always exhibited. I remembered a summer evening in the late 90s when Giselle was just a teenager, crying because she hadn't been invited to a yacht club party. Arthur had sat right here on this workbench, sanding a piece of oak for a new bookshelf, and told her that a person's value isn't measured by the parties they attend, but by the integrity they keep when the lights go out. He had looked at me with those kind, steady eyes and winked as if we shared a secret language of resilience. "Oh, Arthur," I whispered into the darkness, "you always thought I was the soft one, the one who would forgive anything in the name of peace." I realized then that my forgiveness had become a poison, a green light for my daughter to walk all over the memories we had cherished. I looked at the dark bruise already forming on my arm where Spencer's fingers had dug in, and for the first time in my life, I felt the mother inside me die, replaced by a woman who demanded justice. I didn't need to go far to find my first weapon. People often underestimate a woman of 67, especially one who spent 3 decades managing the meticulous operations of a textile mill. They think we are forgetful, that technology is a mountain we cannot climb, but they forgot that I was the one who insisted on installing the hidden security system 2 years ago after a spate of burglaries in the neighborhood. I moved over to a small, inconspicuous metal box tucked behind a stack of winter tires. My hands were stiff from the cold, but my mind was firing with a clarity that felt like a cold flame. I flipped open a hidden panel and pulled out a small tablet I had kept there for emergencies connected to the encrypted cloud server of the house's internal cameras. My heart hammered against my ribs as I swiped through the live feeds. There they were in my kitchen, pouring my expensive scotch into crystal glasses, laughing as if they had just won the lottery instead of assaulting an old woman. Watching them on that screen was like watching a horror movie where the monsters wore the faces of people I once loved. Spencer was leaning back in Arthur's chair, his feet on the table, bragging about how the old bird would probably be begging to sign the deed by sunrise just to get back into the warmth. Giselle was leaning against the counter, casually buffing her nails, complaining about how she'd have to hire a professional cleaner to get the musty grandmother smell out of the curtains once I was gone. She's always been so dramatic. Giselle laughed, the sound coming through the tablet's small speakers like a hiss. "A little cold air will do her good. It'll make her realize she's a burden, not a queen." I felt a strange, grim chuckle bubble up in my throat. They really thought I was a burden. They had no idea that while they were celebrating their petty victory, I was recording every word, every gesture, and every admission of their intent to defraud me. I spent the next 2 hours in that dark garage meticulously downloading the footage of the assault at the front door and the conversation that followed. I made 3 copies, one for the cloud, one for a thumb drive I kept in my hidden lockbox, and one to be sent directly to a very old friend. My back ached, a sharp stabbing reminder of where Spencer had shoved me, but I refused to sit down. I needed the pain. I needed it to fuel the cold resolve that was hardening in my chest. I looked at a photo of Arthur I kept in my wallet, the one where he was smiling in front of the mill on his retirement day. I'm doing it, Philip, I thought. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm ending this. I'm taking back the house you built, even if I have to burn every bridge to the ground to do it. The plan began to form not out of a desire for petty revenge, but as a calculated legal eviction. I knew the laws in Washington, elder abuse and domestic assault, were not things the local police took lightly, especially when the victim had clear, high-definition evidence. But I didn't want a midnight scene with sirens that would allow them to play the victim to the neighbors. I wanted a public, undeniable exposure of their character. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my cell phone, which I had fortunately kept with me. I scrolled past Giselle's name, past the dozens of missed calls from Spencer's debt collectors, and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. When Phineas answered on the 4th ring, his voice was as gravelly and authoritative as I remembered from the days he served as a federal marshal. "Rosalind, it's 4 in the morning. Is everything all right?" He asked, the sleepiness vanishing instantly. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply told him, "Phineas, the storm has finally broken inside my house. I need your help to hold court at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning. I'm serving a final feast, and I need a witness who knows the weight of a badge." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that only comes from a man who has seen the worst of humanity and knows exactly what needs to be done. "I'll be there, Rosie," he said, his voice dropping into that deadly serious tone that used to make criminals tremble in the courtroom. "Lock yourself in the garage until morning. I'm calling the precinct to flag the address, but we'll do it your way. Just hold on." I tucked the phone away and sat back against the workbench, watching the first hints of a bruised purple light begin to bleed through the small garage window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the cold remained a constant companion that reminded me I was still alive. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the tablet, the split lip, the messy gray hair, the eyes that looked 30 years older than they had yesterday. I didn't see a victim anymore. I saw a woman who was about to show two arrogant predators that you should never ever underestimate a librarian with a legacy to protect. My silence for the last 2 days wouldn't be a sign of weakness. It would be the quiet before the gavel falls. I had been a mother for 32 years, but for the next 48 hours I was going to be the executioner of their greed. The kitchen began to warm up as I turned the oven to its highest setting, the mechanical click of the dial sounding like a starting pistol for the marathon ahead. I had waited until the sun began to peek through the towering Douglas firs, casting long skeletal shadows across the linoleum, before I slipped back into the house through the mudroom. Giselle and Spencer were still upstairs, likely sprawled in a drunken stupor, oblivious to the fact that the woman they had discarded was now reclaiming her territory with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned general. My first task was to mask the scent of my presence with the intoxicating aroma of a traditional Sunday brunch, the kind that usually signaled forgiveness and a return to the status quo. I reached for the heavy cast iron skillet, the weight of it familiar and grounding in my trembling hands. I began to sizzle thick strips of hickory-smoked bacon, the salt and fat, popping and spitting in the pan, a sensory smokescreen that would draw them down from their lair with the promise of a peaceful surrender. As the grease began to render, I moved to the mahogany escritoire in the corner of the dining room, a piece of furniture Arthur had refinished for me decades ago. It had a secret compartment behind the stationery drawer, a place where we kept the truly important documents, not just the deeds they were so desperate to steal, but the power of attorney papers and the original trust agreements. My fingers worked quickly, sorting through the crisp parchment. I pulled out a fresh folder and tucked in the printed screenshots from the security footage I had downloaded in the garage, along with a formal notice of eviction I had drafted years ago as a precaution. I felt a grim sense of irony as I placed a festive napkin over the legal documents, hiding the sting of justice beneath a layer of domesticity. Every time I heard a floorboard creak upstairs, I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I forced myself to focus on the rhythmic chopping of onions and bell peppers for the O'Brien potatoes. I wasn't just making breakfast. I was building a cage out of butter flour and legal precedents. I moved with a precision that would have made my old floor supervisors at the mill proud. I cracked 3 dozen eggs into a large ceramic bowl, whisking them until they were a pale, uniform yellow. I thought about how many thousands of eggs I had cracked for Giselle over the years, scrambled for school mornings, poached for her heartbreaks, fried for her late-night returns from parties. I had nourished her body while her soul was rotting right in front of me. Now, as I folded in sharp cheddar and heavy cream, I realized this would be the last time I ever fed her. The thought didn't bring me the sorrow I expected. Instead, it brought a cold, crystalline clarity. I walked to the pantry and pulled out a jar of my homemade blackberry preserves. I remembered Arthur laughing as we picked those berries, his hands stained purple, telling me that the best things in life always required a little bit of sweat and a few thorns. He was right, but he never told me the thorns would come from our own garden. The contrast between the cozy domestic atmosphere I was creating and the icy hatred burning in my chest was almost dizzying. To any neighbor looking through the window, I was just a doting grandmother preparing a feast for her family, but inside I was a woman preparing a burial for a relationship. I set the table with the fine Lenox, the gold rims glinting in the morning light. I polished each silver fork until I could see my own reflection. The split lip was already turning a dark, angry shade of plum, and my eyes looked like flint. I arranged a bouquet of fresh pine boughs and winter jasmine in the center, the scent sharp and medicinal against the sweet smell of the baking cinnamon rolls. I even found a bottle of vintage champagne Arthur had been saving for our 40th anniversary, which was never meant to be. I placed it in a silver bucket with ice, knowing that Spencer's greed would make him reach for it the moment he saw it. He loved the taste of luxury, but he was about to learn that some things are far too expensive for a man of his meager character. While the cinnamon rolls rose in the oven, their sugary glaze bubbling and filling the house with a deceptive warmth, I made one final preparation. I went to the hall closet and pulled out a small portable digital recorder Arthur used to use for his inventory notes. I tested the batteries, cleared the memory, and tucked it into the pocket of my blue crepe dress, the one I had changed into after a quick, scalding shower that had washed the garage grime from my skin. This little device would be my silent witness, capturing every boast, every threat, and every admission of guilt they were bound to make once they smelled the coffee and felt the false security of my silence. I felt like an actress preparing for the role of a lifetime, the submissive, defeated mother who had finally learned her place. It was a humiliating mask to wear, but I knew it was the only way to get them to lower their guard long enough for the trap to spring. The clock on the mantel chimed 7:30, the deep, melancholic bells echoing through the silent house. I stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the bounty of my labor, the golden brown biscuits, the steaming grits, the platters of fruit, and the shimmering legal folder hidden in plain sight. My back was screaming in pain from the assault, a sharp reminder that every kind word I was about to speak would be a lie designed for a greater truth. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and looked at the staircase. I could hear the muffled sound of a shower starting upstairs, the sound of my daughter preparing to face a day she thought would end with her owning this house. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of power that made my hands stop shaking at last. The table was set, the evidence was secured, and the guests of honor were about to walk into a courtroom they mistook for a dining room. Justice was simmering on the stove, and I was the one holding the ladle. The heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps on the staircase signaled the arrival of my two enemies, a sound that in years past might have brought a smile to my face, but today felt like the approach of a thunderstorm. I smoothed the skirt of my blue dress and adjusted my posture, feeling the firm support of the medical belt beneath my clothes, an invisible armor against the physical pain that still pulsed through my back. Spencer appeared first, his eyes bleary and bloodshot, but they widened with a greedy spark the moment he caught the scent of the bacon and cinnamon. He was followed by Giselle, who looked like she'd spent the last hour trying to hide the effects of a hangover behind a mask of expensive foundation. She stopped in the doorway, her nose wrinkling as she surveyed the lavish spread I had laid out on the fine Lenox. For a second, a flicker of something resembling confusion crossed her face, but it was quickly swallowed by the same cold arrogance that had led her to raise her hand against me 48 hours prior. Well, well, looks like the cold air finally knocked some sense into the old bird's head. Spencer remarked, his voice a gravelly slur, as he pulled out Arthur's chair at the head of the table. He didn't even wait for me to speak, before he reached for the champagne bottle, the cork popping with a celebratory sound that felt like an insult to the morning air. He poured himself a glass, the bubbles dancing in the light, and took a long, uncouth gulp before letting out a satisfied belch. I told you, Giselle. A little bit of tough love is all she needed. She's finally realized that we're the ones making the big decisions now. He looked at me with a crooked smirk, his eyes lingering on my split lip with a terrifying lack of remorse. To him, that mark of violence was a trophy, a visible sign that he had successfully broken my spirit. He actually had the audacity to wink at me as if we were co-conspirators in his plan to rob me blind. Giselle sat down across from me, her movements sharp and jerky. She reached for a cinnamon roll, tearing into it with a hunger that seemed to reflect her bottomless greed. I have to admit, Mom, this is a much better look for you than shivering on the porch. At least you remembered how to be useful? She said, her voice dripping with a sugary venom that made my skin crawl. She looked around the room, her eyes already mentally rearranging the furniture to suit her modern aesthetic. Since you've decided to be reasonable, we can discuss the transition plan over brunch. Spencer has a notary coming by later this afternoon. We've already drafted the paperwork to move the title of this house and the lake property into our corporate LLC. It's better for your taxes, really. You won't have to worry about a thing once we take the burden of ownership off your shoulders. I remained silent, sipping my tea with a hand that I forced to remain steady. I watched them pile their plates high with the food I had spent the night preparing, their manners as messy as their morals. Spencer started talking about flipping my garden into a paved patio for entertaining high-net-worth clients, his mouth full of eggs and bacon. He laughed about how Arthur's old shed would be the first thing to go, calling it a shack for junk that lowered the property value. It was a strange kind of comedy watching these two people brag about a future that was already dissolving beneath them. They were so convinced of their own brilliance that they didn't even notice the small digital recorder sitting innocuously inside the pocket of my dress, capturing every word of their intent to defraud an elderly woman. They didn't see the way my eyes kept drifting to the front door, or the way I had set a third place that remained conspicuously empty, a place reserved for the reckoning they didn't see coming. "Don't look so glum, Rosie," Spencer chuckled, gesturing toward me with a silver fork. "Once the papers are signed, we might even let you keep that little garden patch in the back, provided you keep the weeds under control. We need this place to look pristine for the investors. And hey, maybe we'll buy you one of those fancy new hearing aids with the commission from the lake house sale. You seem to be having trouble hearing us lately, specifically when we tell you to give us the keys." He laughed at his own joke, a wheezing hollow sound that echoed through the room. I looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how I had ever allowed such a small, pathetic man to occupy the chair my husband had occupied with such dignity. He thought he was a king, but he was just a jester playing in a castle that was about to collapse on his head. Giselle chimed in, her tone shifting to that fake, manipulative empathy she used when she wanted something. "We're just thinking about your future, Mom. You're getting older, and the house is getting older too. It's too much for you to handle. This way you can live in the basement apartment and we'll take care of all the bills. You'll have your little TV, your knitting, and you won't have to lift a finger. Isn't that what every woman your age wants? A quiet life where the grown-ups take care of the hard stuff." She smiled, showing teeth that were as white and artificial as her concern. I felt the digital recorder in my pocket grow heavy, a silent witness to her betrayal. She was my daughter, the person I had carried for 9 months, and she was talking to me as if I were a senile pet that needed to be kennelled for the convenience of its owners. I finally found my voice, keeping it low and devoid of the anger that was screaming in my head. I asked them if they were truly certain about this path, if they were sure that Arthur would have wanted his hard work to be used to cover Spencer's bad debts. The reaction was instantaneous. Spencer slammed his hand on the table, the fine rattling and the coffee splashing onto the lace cloth. "Arthur is gone." He roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "He's a ghost, and ghosts don't pay the mortgage. I'm the man of this house now, and I say we're moving forward. You're going to sign those papers, or we're going to have a repeat of the fresh air session from the other night. Is that what you want, Rosie? Do you want to spend the rest of the winter in the garage?" Giselle didn't even flinch at his threat. She just sipped her champagne and nodded in agreement. "He's right, Mom. You're being difficult for no reason. Just sign the documents and this all goes away. We can go back to being a happy family and you can go back to your garden. Why make this so hard on yourself?" I looked at the gold-rimmed plate in front of me, at the golden brown biscuits that were now cold, and I realized that the time for talking was over. The trap was fully set, and they had walked right into the center of it with their chests puffed out in arrogant triumph. They were so busy counting the money they hadn't earned that they didn't hear the sound of a car pulling into the gravel driveway, a sound that marked the end of their reign and the beginning of my justice. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a sharp, dry sound that cut through the thick atmosphere of the dining room with absolute authority. Spencer, who had been mid-sentence about his grand plans to demolish Arthur's workshop, froze with a half-eaten biscuit in his hand. Giselle jumped slightly, her champagne glass rattling against the fine, a sudden flicker of unease darting across her face. I didn't move. I simply lowered my teacup and wiped my mouth with the gold-embossed napkin, feeling a strange, hollow calm settle over me. "I'll get it," I said, my voice as steady as the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my blue dress, and walked toward the foyer without glancing back at the two predators who still sat at my table, unaware that the world they had tried to steal was about to be reclaimed. When I opened the front door, the crisp morning air of Olympia rushed in, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Standing on my porch was Phineas, looking every bit the formidable federal marshal he had once been. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, but it was his eyes, flinty and unyielding, that commanded respect. Beside him stood two uniformed officers from the local precinct, their expressions professional and grim. Phineas didn't need to say a word. He simply tipped his head slightly in a gesture of silent support. I stepped aside, allowing the law to enter the house I had spent 40 years protecting. As we walked toward the dining room, the floorboards groaned under the weight of the justice that was about to be served, a sound that felt like the house itself was breathing a sigh of relief. We entered the dining room just as Spencer was standing up, his face shifting from confusion to a sickly shade of gray. He tried to summon his usual mask of arrogance, but his hand trembled as he set the champagne glass down. "Phineas, what the hell is this? We're having a private family breakfast here." Spencer stammered, his eyes darting toward the two officers who were now flanking the doorway. Giselle stood up as well, her face contorting into a mask of fake indignation. "Mom, what have you done? Who are these people? You're making a scene for no reason." She shrieked, her voice reaching that high-pitched, manipulative tone I had heard so many times before. She tried to move toward me, likely intending to grab my arm and whisper a threat, but Phineas stepped forward, his presence blocking her path like a wall of granite. "Sit down, Giselle." Phineas commanded, his voice low and vibrating with a power that silenced her instantly. He didn't wait for them to comply before he pulled a thick legal folder from his breast pocket, the same folder I had prepared with the security footage and the eviction notices. He laid it on the lace tablecloth right next to the cinnamon rolls and the half-empty bottle of champagne. "My name is Phineas Sterling, and I am here as a witness and a representative of the law. We have received a formal complaint of domestic assault and elder abuse at this address, supported by clear, high-definition video evidence of an incident that occurred 48 hours ago." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Spencer's heavy, panicked breathing. Spencer's eyes bulged as he looked at the folder. He tried to laugh, a wheezing, desperate sound. "Evidence. That's ridiculous. It was just a minor argument. Rosie fell on the porch because she's getting old and clumsy." "Right, Rosie. Tell them it was an accident." He looked at me with a pleading intensity that made my stomach turn. I didn't answer him. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder I had been carrying. I pressed play, and the room was filled with the sound of Spencer's own voice. "I'm the man of this house now. Sign those papers or we're going to have a repeat of the fresh air session." Hearing his own cruelty reflected back at him seemed to drain the last bit of color from his face. He collapsed back into his chair, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. Giselle realized the tide had turned, and like a cornered animal she shifted her tactics from aggression to pathetic desperation. She threw herself toward me, her eyes brimming with forced tears. "Mom, please. We were just stressed. Spencer has all these debts and we didn't know what we were doing. You can't let them take us. Think about the family reputation." She tried to grab my hands, her expensive lipstick smearing as she sobbed. "I'm your only child, Mom. You can't do this to me." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt absolute nothing. The mother who would have shielded her from the consequences of her own actions had died on that rainy porch. I pulled my hands away, tucked them behind my back, and said, "The reputation of this family was destroyed the moment you raised your hand against me. The law isn't interested in your excuses, Giselle." Phineas signaled to the officers. "Spencer Vance, you are under arrest for domestic assault and elder abuse. Giselle, you are being charged as an accomplice to the assault and for the attempted fraudulent transfer of property." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the dining room, a sharp metallic sound that marked the end of their reign of terror. Spencer didn't fight. He looked like a broken man as they led him away from the table. Giselle, however, turned into a whirlwind of spite. As they escorted her toward the door, she screamed back at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "I'll tell everyone you're senile, you'll regret this." I watched them being led down the driveway, their voices fading as they were placed into the back of the patrol cars. The neighbors were starting to peek through their curtains. Phineas stayed with me, his hand on my shoulder as we watched the cars pull away. He looked at the table. The ruined feast, the spilled champagne, and the shattered illusion of a family. "You did the right thing, Rosalind. Some cancers can't be treated. They have to be removed," he said softly. I nodded, feeling the weight of the last 48 hours finally begin to lift. I walked back into the kitchen and poured the rest of the champagne down the sink. I wasn't celebrating a victory. I was cleaning a wound. My house was finally quiet again, and for the first time in a year, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a clean slate. As the police cars vanished behind the screen of ancient towering pines, the flashing blue lights finally faded from the damp walls of my foyer. The silence that returned to the house wasn't the suffocating, fearful quiet I had endured for the past year. It was a vast, open space, like a long-held breath finally being released. I stood on the porch for a few minutes, feeling the cool Olympia mist on my face, watching the dust settle on the gravel driveway. Phineas stood behind me, his presence a steady anchor as the adrenaline began to drain from my weary bones. He didn't offer empty platters of comfort or tell me that things would eventually work out with Giselle. He knew me better than that. He knew that some bridges aren't just burned, they are dismantled stone by stone, so they can never be crossed again. "I've already contacted a locksmith, Rosalind," he said, his voice soft but firm. "He'll be here within the hour to change every cylinder in this house." I thanked him and walked back inside my footsteps, sounding light on the hardwood. I went straight to the dining room and began to clear the wreckage of the final feast. I didn't feel the urge to cry as I scraped the cold eggs into the disposal. Each plate I washed felt like a layer of grime being scrubbed from my soul. I gathered every single one of Giselle and Spencer's belongings, the designer bags, the stacks of real estate brochures, and those obnoxious silk ties, and piled them into heavy-duty garbage bags. I hauled the bags to the end of the driveway, right next to the trash bins, and left them there for their lawyer to collect. The motherly instinct to protect was gone, replaced by a fierce, uncompromising loyalty to the woman I had almost lost myself. By noon, the locksmith had finished his work, and I held a set of shiny silver keys in my hand, the only set in existence. I walked through each room, opening the curtains to let in the pale Washington sun, reclaiming each corner that had been tainted by their greed. I sat at my desk and drafted a final letter to the county prosecutor stating clearly that I would not be withdrawing my charges of elder abuse. I also signed the paperwork for a permanent restraining order. Some might call it cold, but I call it survival. I had learned the hard way that a mother's love shouldn't be a blank check for a child's cruelty. I spent the afternoon in Arthur's garden pruning the rose bushes and clearing away the dead leaves. It was hard work, my back still ached from the night on the porch, but the labor felt sacred. I was tending to my own life again, nurturing the soil that had been neglected while I was busy trying to fix two people who were determined to stay broken. That evening, I sat on the porch with a simple cup of tea watching the fog roll back in from the sound. I looked at the vacancy where their car used to be and felt a profound, exhilarating sense of freedom. I thought about the audience listening to my story and realized the lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about the sanctity of boundaries. We are told that family is everything, but family is a privilege, not a right. If you allow someone to destroy your peace just because they share your DNA, you aren't being a saint. You're being an accomplice to your own destruction. I took a sip of my tea and smiled at the quiet forest. I am 67 years old, I am a widow, and I am a survivor. My house is no longer a prison and my life is no longer a sacrifice. I am finally and absolutely free. As I sit here in the quiet glow of the sunset, I realize that my story isn't just about a house or a deed, it's about the courage to reclaim one's soul. To those of you listening, especially those who have spent decades giving everything to your families, I want to say this. Your kindness is a gift, but it should never be a doormat. We often forgive because we think it's our duty as parents, but true love also requires the strength to say, enough. Protecting an abuser, even if they are your own child, only feeds the monster and starves the victim. I chose to stop being a victim so that I could finally live as a woman with dignity. I hope my journey reminds you that it is never too late to draw a line in the sand and protect your peace. Your silver years should be a time of harvest and joy, not a season of fear and sacrifice. Your presence and your time mean the world to me. I truly wish you and your loved ones a life filled with health-abundant luck and the strength to always stand up for what is right. If this story touched your heart or offered you a new perspective, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Your comments and feedback are the greatest motivation for me to continue writing and sharing even more powerful stories like this one. Please share this video with your friends and family so that we can spread this message of strength to those who might need it most. Until the next story, stay strong and take care of yourselves.